Good evening. This is Rafael Collazo, and you're watching and listening to the Found in Translation VCast and podcast special post-Democratic debate special post-game show night 2 featuring your host, Rafael Collazo. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're listening to this as a podcast, continue to download and subscribe to the podcast on the Raise Latino Talk podcast feed. And then we can download the podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, the list goes on and on. And of course, we welcome our VCast watchers and listeners, our audience on Facebook Live, as well as on YouTube Live and Periscope. This is your host, Rafael Collazo, and we're going to break down from a Latino perspective day 2, night 2 of the Democratic presidential debate. And who better than the producer of this special VCast episode and my dear Dominican compadre, Elbert Garcia. Elby.
Hey, Ray, how you doing?
This is exciting. As Eminem once uttered, guess who's back?
We're back for another night of winners and looters and people who shook down others and people who should be shooken down after this debate. So,
shook is a good word to sum up a lot of the emotions that many of us are feeling after night 2. And, this is, we really like this to be the best part of this community is to engage the many voices that we have not only locally, but throughout the country. And when we put the call out to our great friends around the country, we were so happy when this man was available to join us, not only from the perspective of an activist, from the perspective of an American that lives in a border state, someone that's very thoughtful about the future of our country, but also one of the great Latino journalists and minds and media minds and communications minds in our community, the editor and publisher of VanguardArizona.com, James Garcia. James, welcome back, brother.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Great night to be back. Really looking forward to talking about what we just saw happen.
This was really exciting. And again, if people are watching on Facebook, please, or Periscope or any of our platforms, please share this information. If you're seeing it live or seeing it as a YouTube video, we want people from our community to continue to have these conversations, because what's happening is you're texting your friends, you're calling each other, and you're saying a lot of these same things, saying, how come there isn't an outlet to describe my perspective on these things? Who's talking about Hispandering? And we're going to talk about the impact of language from night 1 last night. Who's talking about Julian, the sort of the residue or the aftermath of Julian Castro's entrance to the stage? Who's talking about immigration in a thoughtful way? Who's talking about the issues that we care about? And what happened from our perspective, whether you live in the Southwest, East Coast, Florida, or anywhere around the country and around the world. So continue to share. And Elbert, why don't you remind people how they can engage live in this conversation via our chat and login function?
Definitely. And so we're being broadcast. You're seeing this either on Facebook and or on Twitter and Periscope. But if you want to get in on the action, you want to ask your questions, really get into this, please go to the Crowdcast platform. The address is crowdcast.io/0627 post debate. We'll put it in the Facebook link. We'll put it in the Twitter link again. It should be already there. Sign up and sign in. And that way, who knows, if you've got a webcam here, you've got some good things to say and want to be on screen, we'll invite you up on screen to join us as well. I know there were a bunch of people who were really interested, a bunch of folks here in Miami, especially local folks. A lot of them are still at watch parties and in places that are really down, so they can't join us. But again, if you have a good idea, definitely we welcome your comments. We read your comments last night on Facebook and on Twitter. But again, join us in on the Crowdcast platform. Go to crowdcast.io/0627 post debate. And again, I'll put the link down there for people to specifically.
And it would be great we always love the interaction with our sort of activist network and our friends around the country. And particularly, we'd love to get a couple women into this conversation, because it is not lost on us that it's 3 dudes. So we'd love to get more diversity, more voices in general in this conversation. Let's talk big picture. Would like to get, let's start with you, James. Would like to get your initial reactions, your big picture thoughts around day 2 of the Democratic presidential debate.
Well, I think if I were just going to talk about day 2 for the moment, the first thing you have to say is that a lot of folks went after Biden, right? I mean, they decided that they needed to speak up. They needed to challenge him in a bunch of different ways, right? There were some people that were sort of talking about it's time to pass the torch, Mr. Biden. There were folks who were challenging his record in the Senate and in Congress in general over the many decades that he's been there or was there. There were people, I think, even challenging him, of course, on his record during the Obama administration. So people weren't afraid to go after him. Most of the candidates were polite, respectful. I don't think anybody, was rude and sort of out of line. But I think collectively they made the point that this is not he's not the chosen one. That he isn't. This isn't going to be a cakewalk for him. That we're here, we have something to say. And when they spoke, they didn't just challenge him. They delivered policy initiatives. They talked about in detail what they would do if they were president, and sometimes talked about why his ideas weren't as strong. So I found that I found that refreshing and encouraging, because I don't believe, particularly this early in the campaign, that people should just sort of assume that this is Mr. Biden's race to sort of decide whether he wants to be president or not, or the nominee.
Albert, you and I have been really fixated on the theatrics of the first few days of the debate, and I was thinking as I was watching it, this has a much more combative, more rhythmic tone to it. It was almost like yesterday was preseason. We were talking about sort of preseason college ball, and this was against a tournament. Sort of, there was a pace, there was a rhythm. People were speaking louder. So, how much of that, Albert, do you think was playing off the lessons learned from night one, from the campaign's observations, as opposed to what James spoke about, which is a big theme of the night, which was, we have the champ is in the building. We got to knock out the champ, which is Joe Biden, which sort of also led to that combative vibe.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think people looked at yesterday's debate. People saw the performances, and think people saw that, first of all, this time goes really, really quickly, and they needed to make a quick statement and need to make themselves, sure that they were being clear, and that they were being authentic. So I think that definitely played a role there. I think the other thing is that today really we saw front and center a party that doesn't have all the answers, right? And I think it wasn't afraid to shy away from that. I think, as we talked about yesterday, I think the stakes were higher in this one. You had folks coming in and really had to kind of show. I think Biden needed to show that he should be relevant. Not that he could be, but that he should be. I think Bernie comes in with a lot of support and a lot of people saying, but people also want to know, hey, this can't be Bernie. This can't be Bernie 2016. Like, are you going to be able to step it up? Because we know every political campaign is different. You can't just come up with the same thing. So can you do that? And so I thought that people were definitely much more aggressive. I think you saw a lot more division there. But I don't think as James said, I don't think it was a nasty kind of thing. I think this was definitely, this at times felt like a very wonkish kind of conversation, and people kind of talking about whether or not they could do that or not. That being said, these are some real issues that are at the core of what folks think this election should be about. And what I didn't hear people say, or at least not that much, was, well, what is it going to give? What plan are we going to give that's going to give us the majority, of the voters to vote, right? And so I think there was a lot of discussion in some ways about the difference between, I think Gillibrand said this at the point, what's the difference between, it shouldn't necessarily be capitalism versus socialism. We're talking about either good capitalism or bad capitalism, right? And so I think that there were these kind of side conversations about that that sounded a little bit interesting, but folks knew that they had to kind of come and show improvement. I think we'll get into a little bit about that, especially in terms of Biden, and it seemed like Biden and everybody, right? Biden and Kamala Harris, Biden and Bernie Biden, and everybody else, at least at the very beginning.
I'm going to ask James in a second to comment about his thoughts around sort of the level of conversation related to issues, because I think in my opinion, today was more of a discussion around ideology than yesterday. But I want to get James's thoughts on that. But I would want to say on sort of tone and almost desperation. I almost felt like a lot of people, I think last night really impacted the tenor of today, because I think a lot of the sort of B and C level tier candidates realized like this may be their only shot, and really felt the sense of urgency around not feeling left behind. And for the most part, felt like they had to do whatever they had to do to get their message in. But I wanted to ask you, James, what did you think? And in a second, we're going to get into the Biden-Kamala dynamic, which I think was was one of the big themes of tonight,
Yeah.
and other people's thoughts about the candidates. But I wanted to ask you, James, around what do you think? Do you feel we had what was your thought about the discussion of the issues? Thinking about the very much the ideological debate around where we go at healthcare, which was not only about ideology but also about viability for us winning in 2020 or Democrats winning in 2020. I mean, people were pretty blunt about that, and then some of the other issues, particularly around race relations and other things,
Yeah,
that sort of centered around it.
yeah. I mean, I think certainly, certainly they spent some serious time talking about the concept of Medicare for all, and a lot of people dove right in with their views specifically on healthcare. But there was a lot of conversation that was, in some ways, echoing Elizabeth Warren from last night in terms of the divide between the rich and the poor, and the lack of gains in the middle class and the working class over the last few decades. There was a lot of economic sort of conversation kind of on that level, that sort of populist conversation, right? Which I think was good. I think most of these folks were bringing policy to the table from their own unique perspective. Good discussion about climate change, Kamala's conversation about it not just being climate change, but really being a climate crisis that we're in. Biden trying to at least suggest that he was ahead of the game. He and Obama were ahead of the game, and that they're somehow years ahead of this discussion. I think that's a debatable point. But I think all in all, I was pleased generally with the fact that they were coming out of the blocks, talking policy and describing what their platforms were. And I think collectively, they were delivering the message that now contrast us with what you're hearing from the Republican side, that of course, specifically Donald Trump, and the fact that he's a man who seems to hate not just facts, but detail and the wonky stuff that presidents should have at their fingertips. He seems to abhor that. And we're telling you that look at us. If you look at this slate and the folks you saw last night, we're talking about people who are qualified to be on this stage tonight, and will do a substantially better job of not just addressing the whole array of issues that are pressing in this country, but doing it from the perspective that we should be thoughtful and informed and forthright. I think that generally that was the thrust of the message that they were collectively delivering, and that's the contrast in great many ways between them and Trump.
And you've been listening to James Garcia from Vanguard, Arizona, or watching on our video platforms, and Elbert Garcia, political strategist out of Florida, and your host, Ray Collazo, the Found in Translation VCast podcast, radio show, and whatever form you're listening and watching this. And thank you for joining us late on the East Coast in particular, but still amped up after day two of the first of many Democratic debates. LB, I think the story tomorrow is going to be that moment when Kamala Harris had her moment with Biden and called the question. You know, it's interesting because we all thought people like Beto O'Rourke, and particularly tonight, Mayor Buttigieg, would want to draw that generational contrast. And to me, the person that drew that generational contrast and sort of where the Democratic Party should go or is gone was Kamala, discussing her being a child that was bused, and Joe Biden as compared to someone that was in the Senate that was playing the middle and compromising, and certainly people could argue was siding with people that were resistant to education desegregation from the 70s. I thought that was the highlight of the evening. Very poignant, gripping. It really showed kind of gender, race, generation, ideology, all wrapped up in an incredible moment.
Yeah, I thought, I think there was some question about whether or not people were gonna try to treat Joe Biden with kind of kid gloves, right? And I think that was definitely, I mean, we definitely forgot about that from the very beginning, right? But I think the thing about Kamala Harris, I think that impresses a lot of people about her, right, is that, and maybe it's because she was a former prosecutor, right? But she has a way really of getting down to the heart of the matter in a nice, good, succinct, clear way, right? And she made it personal from the very beginning. She was like, this is not no theoretical issue. I was one of those folks, right? I was one of those folks that busing impacted. And she also talked about it when it came to race. You know, at some point, it was almost hilarious because everyone was talking about race. And she was like, hey, remember, I'm the only black candidate here. I should at least definitely
yeah.
talk about.
She reclaimed her time, brother. She reclaimed her time.
And
do you think it was effective? Do you think that direct confrontation around busing from 40-something years ago, you could argue, right? Like, wow, that was a long time ago. It was a different era. Biden has certainly, you can argue, some civil rights bona fides over these decades of service. But that, to me, how people react to that moment, I think, is what people are going to walk away with. James, what do you think about that moment? How do you think Kamala and Joe handled it?
Yeah, I mean, I think she did herself a lot of good. If people took the time to watch her questioning Justice Kavanaugh during those hearings, then they would have seen the same personality, right, at work, the same kind of very blunt, here's what I have to ask you, and I'm not taking no for an answer kind of thing. And so they heard that, but a lot of people didn't see that, right? And so this was probably the first time that they were getting a real taste of who Kamala Harris is and the way that she handles herself. And again, I think she didn't flinch, but she also challenged him in a very direct way, and somewhat subliminally, or more nuanced way, I should say. She was raising that question of sort of the generational difference, right? Because it was 40 years ago, and she was a child then, and he was a grown man, a white man, a grown man making a decision about integration and busing and so forth. And so she was telling us, either intentionally or not, that I'm from a different time and I'm grown, right? I'm from another generation and I'm grown, and you don't have a lot to teach me, Mr. Biden, with all due respect, right?
And I almost felt like, if I could, LB, that you can sum up the theory of the case from a campaign perspective, how Kamala wins this race by that interplay, because essentially what she was trying to do, again, thinking about the theatrics of this, is that she's trying to connect on an emotional level with, I mean, you could argue, if you really want to boil this out, black voters in the South, black voters in South Carolina, that middle-aged, that older black woman, who's basically going to decide who wins this, who's going to decide Biden's fate in this nomination process. Because similarly to Clinton in 2008, when the black community, once they saw Obama as viable after Iowa, and that those other slip-ups of the Clintons during that process flipped. And that's essentially, if you look at the math of the early states, what Kamala's banking, and Booker too, as well, would be banking on. And so I almost felt like she was trying to channel the emotions and the history of the people that are going to make that decision. Now, is the other part of the equation? She has to prove that she's viable, and so can she do Iowa, New Hampshire, well enough to be viable by that point? But I thought, I thought she's the one that drew that contrast. Very interesting. LB, how do you think Biden handles himself? He was getting hit from left and right, and particularly the racial stuff, which we knew was going to be sensitive.
I was going to say two things. I think in terms of Kamala Harris, I think, she was able to challenge him, and in essence, to also challenge even a couple of the other white folks, without seeming mean or seeming over the head or seeming, any of these other things.
She was aggressive. She was forward, but she wasn't like the angry black woman.
And again, it seemed controlled. It seemed like it seemed presidential. Right?
That's the word.
I mean, it seemed presidential, right? Like she was fighting without being without in essence being wrong in that way. I think the other thing too is that contrast how Biden answered the question versus how Mayor Pete addressed the question about race head on, right?
Yes.
And I thought it was interesting because Mayor Pete was just like, you know what? I didn't do a good job. I could do better. He wasn't tiptoeing around it, right? And I think you heard this like he and hawing kind of a Biden that kind of sounded like a politician of old, trying to fight the old thing. And again, that's you can't take away the DNA of elected officials. They are who they are, right? Like that's who they are, right? So Biden's gonna be Biden, right? But I just thought that the contrast in terms of answering the question and answering potentially a sensitive question, he could have done a bunch of things. He could have said, hey, at the time I thought this was necessary, but now in retrospect, maybe not, right? Whatever. He could have figured out a way in time, but in many ways it felt like he had to defend the person who he was. And look, as an older candidate, he has to show that he has the fight, right? And so he was gonna be like, no, I did what I did, and it is what it is, and that's it, right? And their explanation of it. But sometimes in explaining, we know this all. Like sometimes you can spend so much time explaining that not only do you sound defensive, but you sound like you're trying to avoid the answer or trying to avoid responsibility. And so I just thought it was a contrast, in that way.
Yeah, if I may, I think that part of what I was reading from the vice president's body language and his tone was a bit of that kind of establishment arrogance. Like, what really gives you the right to ask me this question? And here's a list of my accomplishments, all over the years. And based on this list, you shouldn't even really be asking me this question, right? And I don't think that's a great approach, sort of in this time in which Trump has done so much damage on these particular issues involving race and gender and all of the issues that in many ways Kamala Harris was bringing up, right? And that Buttigieg was forced to address because of what's been happening in South Bend, right? They, I think, in some ways, were answering those questions or addressing those issues with more of an understanding of the time and era that we are in. And the vice president, on some level, was saying, none of this is new, and I've done it all before, and I'll do it all again. And there's a kind of establishment political arrogance about that I was a little uncomfortable with.
Interesting. So do you think, James? So do you think Biden was damaged by tonight? How do you think Biden comes out of this first debate?
I think that succinctly, Biden became three-dimensional again. Right, he's sort of skated for the first few weeks of his candidacy with a kind of two-dimensional "I'm an Obama Biden Democrat" as a kind of offhand sort of slogan, and he hasn't been challenged. And I don't think that he was particularly damaged tonight, but he became three-dimensional, and now people, I think, are going to be as voters out there, as they follow his campaign, are going to be more willing to kind of ask some harder questions because some of those questions were brought up tonight.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think he still would be the front runner. I don't think he.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Bad performance, but I think to your point, he feels beatable. He didn't feel like invincible after this. It's almost like when the Raptors, you beat the Warriors game 1 or 2. Oh, well, maybe they can be beat. Like it. There's certainly it did. I certainly don't think Kamala or Mayor Pete or even Bernie or the other major candidates are feeling like this guy's going to be invincible. We'll see how the polls play out. I want to talk about Bernie Sanders, Mayor Pete, the other candidates, but I want to give us a quick second to catch our breath. I don't know. I see someone in the chat, Elby, Mr. Bodenweiser. Is that someone that would want to jump in, or just someone that would like to chat a question?
I don't know. I want to say hi to Mr. Bodenweiser. I also want to give a shout out to a couple of folks on Facebook,
yes,
who are also joining us there. Tanya Valencia, Scarlett Pineda, our good friend Madeline Villanueva. You also have folks like Calixto Chinchilla, Anna Leffer. In terms of they're all enjoying us. In terms
cast
of
here. This is very nice.
Yeah. It's a good cast. I think
we used to have on the Love Boat when it went to Acapulco. Only the 8 celebrities. See, I'm showing my age. I'm younger. I'm older than I look, I guess. But yes,
I think Madeline brought up a good question in terms of talking
please.
about
Love to hear the interaction.
How Marianne Williams was pointing out how the party should be open to reparations, and again about that issue around race. And so I thought that was a really good point. I think we got that engagement between. In terms of, I mean, I think it's a good question. Now, how does she change the dynamic, of the, or at least the conversation, right? In terms of about race. If he doesn't say anything, do we even get this discussion around race?
Well, you'd have to be paying really close attention. But she was the first candidate, even before Julian and some of the other candidates early on, to bring up the conversation of reparations, which now has been discussed sort of on a congressional legislative level. I think they wanted to run away from that. I mean, what I saw, they wanted to run away from that particular conversation as fast as possible. So I don't think it made a big impact in terms of this debate. But Marianne has certainly made it a conversation point. I don't know if she's going to, after tonight, frankly, I don't think she's going to do much more in this race. But she's definitely put it in the conversation. I wonder, any other questions or any other feedback from the audience, LB, we'd like to share?
I think everyone's enjoying the conversation and dialogue, and they want to hear, winners and losers. And
I got you. So please continue, if you're either on Periscope or Facebook, continue to put your comments. LB will relay them, and of course, if you have the opportunity to jump on the chat room, you can answer chat here, but partly on Facebook or Periscope, just keep interacting. We'll answer your questions, and we'll bring up your points and shout. I did want to, watching and listening to the Founding Translation VCast and radio show and podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We're here with two great political analysts and journalists and media professionals, James Garcia from VanguardiaArizona.com and Elbert Garcia out of Florida. Let's talk about Bernie. I'm struggling with what
Bernie.
Yeah. I'm struggling. I usually kind of, it's one of those things where, that song the teenagers listen to, Meet Me in the Middle. I don't know who sings that. I think it's Vita. Yeah, my kids like it. Meet me in the middle. I feel like Bernie's in the middle. Like, I don't know if he did he physically was in the middle between Kamala and Biden, and I feel like that's where he was metaphorically. I don't think he did a bad job, but at the same time, I don't feel like his performance was memorable, if that makes sense. James, what do you think about Bernie tonight?
I think you're saying what I'm thinking in a slightly different way. I think Bernie was Bernie, right? and there was no expectation that he was going to be anything different than he's been for the last several years on the national stage, and he delivered, right? He delivered the message that people expected him to bring to the table, and yet in some ways similar to Biden, there was something a little bit out of sync with what he was discussing or how he was presenting it. And I think some of it is sort of quantified by this conversation, the conversation that he has in particular about healthcare, right? And it's an extremely complicated issue, right? And he seems to make it seem as if it's the simplest thing on earth. And I'll get into office, and everyone will give up all of their private health insurance, and they'll sign right up, right? And he's so insistent about it, and it doesn't seem, frankly, I think probably to most Americans, and certainly not to me, that that's likely to happen in any sort of immediate way. I do think, though, I will say this, that I think after last night and tonight, that I think I'm really inspired on some level by all of the candidates' sort of collective willingness to hone in on delivering a message that says we're going to do something better than we have been doing on healthcare. We think that Obamacare was a good start, and we're going to build on that. And it could be Medicare for all, or it could be some other variation of that. But we're not going to let this lie, and we're certainly not going to allow President Trump to try to do what he's done on healthcare. And that's encouraging to me, because I do think that the 2018 midterms were decided largely on what people thought about healthcare, or their fear that it was all of a sudden it's all going to be taken away, right? So I'm glad that they've honed in on that, and that they pushed that conversation forward. But I didn't necessarily see Bernie hurt himself or help himself by tonight. He just sort of, to me, kind of plateaued.
I agree. LB, what do you think? I'm on the same page as James. I'm still trying to figure out what I think about how he comes out of tonight.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is, I think there were definitely times, look, he knows he's the Medicare for all guy, right? I think he definitely knows that. And so he's going to defend that. And when anyone thinks that that's not possible, or that's a pie in the sky dream, or
and especially, I'm sorry to cut you off, but what was interesting about sort of the draw is he ended up with a bunch of moderates on the issue in this draw. So he was getting attacked more than I think. It's kind of the way it played out. And it's particularly because, the Hickenloopers and the Bennetts and a few others, like this, with some of them, they really were feeling like this was their only shot, right? So it was interesting, to your point earlier, James, the moderates felt confident to be moderate, and they felt indirectly were attacking Bernie. But to your point, LB, please continue.
No, and it, as opposed to yesterday, right, where like the moderate voices just like we're kind of getting drowned out, right, by
Exactly.
the dreams and stuff like that. And so and again, I think this was a policy decision. And honestly, I don't think I think it's kind of silly personally to wonder whether or not is this possible or is this not possible, right? To get into the minutia of those kind of things, because the reality is that when we talked about the Affordable Care Act, it had to go through a bunch of hoops anyway to get passed, right? So what gets passed and what doesn't get passed. And to James' point, I can't recall the last time there are these points in history, I think, where parties decide that they're gonna attach their future to a particular issue, right? To a certain degree, you saw it. Not to a certain. I mean, you saw it with the GOP and Republicans with tax cuts, right? Like that's their bread and butter. It's been since the 1980s. That's just their constant core belief is that you give someone a tax cut and the country angels in heaven come down and grant us wealth, right? And so that's what the GOP believes, right? And it seemed to me that the Democrats particularly were talking about universal health care, however you get it, Medicare for all, transition, whatever, that this was going to be their core, that this is going to be their core, which is interesting because I'm not sure if the average millennial wants necessarily healthcare as their core issue, right? I don't know. And I think that's where this debate and where the party is trying to figure it out, because I think it's almost like
and let's get real.
How much stool of like climate change,
is your
healthcare,
average,
and something else.
How much is your average person, much less your average younger person, really understand what Medicare for all means? I mean, my organization, when Needlers US, my day job, like we, in the last several months, have had an opportunity to analyze his proposal because it wasn't accessible. So if insiders are just understanding it and sort of engaged in it, it is about sort of a concept and a vision, and he can argue it's about leadership, right? Like who's gonna have the strength and the willingness to put political capital into to really step up to pharma and step up to go down the list, right? So
I saw him today, and just one fact, I did start to see him though think about how do you tie this in, right? He did this towards the end when he talked about abortion, right? And he said and reproductive rights, and he said, well, at the end of the day, that's covered, right, under my Medicare for all, right? And I think he talked about in terms of like and whether it was, I can't remember if it was directly in the debate, but I know that it's been swirling around talking about Medicare for all as partly as a racial justice issue and these kind of things. So I think he's going to be hard pressed in these debates to go beyond Medicare for all, right? Because I think you're starting to see his campaign do that. We're talking about the student debt and student debt being like a racial justice issue, especially among millennials. You see a couple of those things, but we didn't get to hear as much of that, right? Because I felt like part of it was that, both the moderators and I think the other candidates wanted to really, kind of really attack him on this thing because he's the most visible face of socialism.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I mean, I think about the contrast between Sanders tonight and Elizabeth Warren last night. In many ways, they're delivering a pretty similar message. But by the end of the night last night, as you always do with Elizabeth Warren, the insistence that my plan is right came with some details, right? And that's not necessarily what we got a lot of with Bernie Sanders tonight. A lot of what Bernie was saying was sort of delivered in terms of listen to me, I'm insisting on this, and I'm right, and you need to believe me because I'm always telling you what I really believe, and it was there was a much more, to me, sort of emotional, progressive, far left message being delivered by Bernie tonight, whereas Warren comes off with this similar message, a lot of the same sort of thrust, but with some details underlined. It's like, by the way, take these facts with you and think about what I'm telling you tonight too.
Yeah, no, and to sort of tie this in, I'll get to back to Mayor Pete, which should be the next candidate I wanted to touch on, is that on some level, the last thing I want to say about Bernie is Bernie's a victim of his own success, because there's no way without Bernie that these last two nights would have been as progressive and as left around healthcare issues. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, particularly around healthcare issues and economic issues and just in general, So now that he's drawn the conversation towards him, now other factors come into play. Pay, details, charisma, contrast, leadership, and everything else. And so, and in the same light, I would say that that Julian Castro and talking about him in his discussion on immigration pulled the immigration conversation to the left tonight, to the point where we were talking about do we allow the undocumented to get access to our healthcare system, and do we allow the undocumented to be dealt with in a civil manner, not in a criminal matter? And so that gets me to Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who got awfully woke on these issues.
Let me pull a Gillibrand on you. Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Well, I don't got a choice. So
move away from that. I think that you're right in many ways. So many of the other candidates have come to Bernie Sanders, right, in terms of where he is on the spectrum. But I think so much of that, of course, has been driven by how outrageously far to the almost fascist right Trump has brought American politics in general, right?
That's true.
And so,
combination
the ability to say so many things that are so progressive on immigration are being contrasted against him allowing creating the situation in which a father and his daughter die on the banks of the Rio Grande, or children are caged, or so on and so forth, right? And so in some ways, Trump is also as much has as much to do with the fact that the party can swing so much more progressively and still, to most Americans, sound, I think, quite legitimate.
That's true, because you could certainly argue if immigrants weren't being treated this horrifically, we probably wouldn't have been as progressive in the response today, right? In these conversations the last two. That's a very good point, James. James, what's your general thought about Pete Buttigieg's performance? Awfully woke, I thought. Interesting.
Yeah, I think Buttigieg, for the last week has been dealing with obviously a horrific situation in South Bend with the killing of that. I think he was an unarmed black man. Yet another unarmed black man in America being killed, and
allegedly had a knife. But yeah.
Oh, he had a knife. Oh, that's at least
allegedly. Well, there's no body camera, so we don't know.
Right. And he seems to. It seemed to have thrown him off of his game, right? And that was kind of what the reporting was about, how he was handling that or not handling it all that well. And so part of what he had to do tonight was say, I'm here on the national stage, and if that issue gets raised or any issue gets raised, I need to be back on my game. And I think he was. I think in general, he was the Pete Buttigieg who's been out there gaining ground. And to Elbert's point about what he said when he was confronted about the situation in South Bend, it sounded a tad rehearsed to me, but that's okay. I mean, I think he needed to sort of sit down and say, what am I going to say when they bring this up? I thought it was thoughtful. I don't think he ran from the issue. I don't think he necessarily solved it, probably to most people's satisfaction in South Bend, especially the African American community. But I do think that he tried to deal with it as forthright and as honestly as he could. It reminded me of how the chief of police here at Phoenix handled the situation just about 10 days ago, in which there was a somewhat similar situation. Nobody was shot, thank God, but it was another incredibly ugly example.
Oh my God! Yeah,
unarmed
Barbie doll girl. Oh my God!
Right, they could have been killed, right? And she was forthright and looked straight in the camera and said, I'm not going to apologize for these folks, but I also think we still they still deserve due process. And I agree with that. I mean, you and I can look at video and sometimes go, oh yeah, this person is guilty as hell. But no matter what, they still deserve due process.
Absolutely. LB, I agree with James. I think Mayor Pete had a pretty strong performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting with these debates, it's always a question of whether or not, did anyone hurt themselves? Did anyone give us a reason to think why they should be in the next one or shouldn't be in the next one?
Mm-hmm.
And I think Mayor Pete, at the end of the day, sounded like, okay, well, I can justify why. So I can see why so many people are excited by him, right? I don't necessarily think he wowed everyone, in terms of bowling over. Partly because I think he's not coming in as a surprise, right? I think people are coming in saying, okay, he's a pretty strong candidate that way. I of course noted when he talked about the religious hypocrisy of the GOP, right? Which I think a lot of people know. And I think I can't. I'm trying to figure out when's the last time I actually heard a candidate at this national level on that high of a stage talk about it in that way. I've heard about it in the church. I've heard elected officials say about it when they're in church settings and religious settings, but I can't quite recall the last time I heard someone take a party and potentially take a certain group of folks, maybe how you want to think about it, evangelicals or Christians or whatever, and saying, hey, as a party, you guys don't get to wear that mantle anymore. Right? Not when you're treating children like this at the border, not when you're trying to do like that. And I thought that's, if there's something that I pull away from Mayor Pete saying, hey, he said something that if he wasn't there, someone might not have said it. Right. And so in that way, I think, again, who's thinking about it's the end of the month. Do I have a little soundbite that I can use to fundraise off of or whatever? I think Mayor Pete could have, had a moment or two for that, right? I don't think he had as good a moment as Gillibrand, because I thought Gillibrand had a couple of those moments there that I think did a little bit better.
We'll get to your dear senator. We'll get to your dear senator.
I'm pulling a Gillibrand now. I want to make sure I got a little.
That's in the other candidate block. James, you have a thought on this?
On Pete, on Mayor Pete, I should say. He at least deserves that, right, Mayor Pete? I don't know that well. But I think I think first of all, I think you're absolutely right, Albert, that his comments on the hypocrisy of the Republican Party touting itself as essentially the church, the party of God, which it often does, and the party that is somehow closer to Jesus than the rest of the country. I think him challenging them on the kinds of policies that they are de facto supporting, including the things that President Trump is doing to children on the border and their families. I think that gained him some points out there in the American public. People will resonate with, particularly the Democratic Party, and they'll carry that away with him. The only other thing I would say about Mayor Pete, though, is that I don't think that folks who watched tonight necessarily thought that we're necessarily convinced that this is the man who, above all the rest here and the ones we saw last night, who should be president. I don't think that America's quite ready to go that far with him. Maybe the thought is he just needs to be a little bit more seasoned, or we wish he was a U.S. senator right now, or he could be Kamala Harris's vice presidential pick, and wouldn't that be amazing? An African American woman and a gay man, a married gay man, by the way. I think I don't know that America's. It doesn't have anything to do with him being gay, I don't think, in particular. I think folks out there are probably just sort of thinking
he's 37 years
very
old.
Smart.
You know what I mean?
He's very smart, and he's really competent, and he's good on his feet. But
talented guy.
Does he quite have the right stuff? Is he quite seasoned enough? It's kind of the same way I feel about Cory Booker too. Super smart, incredibly passionate, but is he quite ready for the big show?
Before we get
James,
into,
I have to agree with you about that about Mayor Pete. I think there were times that you looked at him and you said, "Dag, why is he not in the U.S. Senate?" Right? Or is there a Senate race going on in Indiana? Right? Like, I think definitely that there was a thought about that.
I think it'll be interesting to see if certainly nothing's happened the last 2 days that changes the dynamic between sort of if it's indeed Mayor Pete or Beto for some people, for the hearts and minds of the younger candidates. Certainly nothing's changed because Mayor Pete was much stronger. The question I think now will be, will that conversation now turn to Mayor Pete or Mayor Julian? Because now, to me, Julian is standing more toe-to-toe, somewhat, even though with a better resume, right? Because of his national experience and, being mayor of a city 10 times larger. So it'll be interesting to see if that contrast, if it turns to that contrast. Because he can't get to Biden until he becomes the leader of sort of this new generation.
Yeah, Julian Castro did himself a lot of good last night. I had a friend say to me when I said, "Well, what do you think about Julian?" I went to his town hall, his Fox News town hall that he had here in Phoenix, and I thought, it was the first time I was able to sort of really sit and listen to him at length, talk about issue after issue, and take every single question and throw it right back at the Fox interrogators, who were all trying to they were trying to trap him. They were trying to trap him a few times, and I thought he handled himself really well. And I said to my friend, "What do you think? What do you think of him?" "Oh, he's a nice guy, but he doesn't have any edge. He's missing an edge, right? And I think in some ways last night he delivered that edge. He essentially said, hey, I'm not just a smart, guy who happens to have a...
Hello?
Did we lose him a little?
That helped him.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I wanna ask my panelists what they think about the conversation around the immigration issue during this conversation. James, if you want to chime in about sort of both days, has the conversation on immigration been sort of comparable to the crisis we're dealing with, and obviously the larger immigration issue on the federal level? But I wanted to just sort of just remind people again, thank you so much for watching and listening to the Found in Translation Vcash radio show and podcast. This is your host, Rafael Collazo. You can find as a podcast the Found in Translation podcast. Todavía still on the Raise Latino Talk podcast feed. We'll be rebranding in the coming weeks. And you obviously can see it on all of our platforms and social media. Thank you again for listening and watching the show. I'm here with James Garcia from VanguardArizona.com and Elbert Garcia. LB, what's your where can people find you on social media nowadays to continue this conversation with you in particular?
Well, people can find me both on Facebook and on Twitter at Elbert Garcia FL, because I am in the Sunshine State of Florida. And people can find me there. Ray, I just wanted to quickly
the
update
real
folks.
305. The real 305. Yes, LB, jump in.
Yeah, me and Pitbull haven't necessarily had a conversation, but yeah, no, definitely. I'm definitely in the 305, not Mr. But I did want to make sure that we're also giving a shout out to our folks over in Facebook who are really enjoying our conversation here. Madeline Villanueva, as we were talking about Mayor Pete, dropped a link about Mayor Pete over at the Breakfast Club, where he made an appearance 3 months ago in terms of talking about a bunch about things there. So Mayor Pete certainly not afraid to talk to folks and meet people where they're at as opposed to where he wants them to be. So I think that partly was her point there. Also, I know we want to talk about immigration. Tanya Valencia also had a question that we wanted to keep in mind. She said, what are your thoughts on the segment of women's health and reproductive rights, especially when Gillibrand spoke directly to the quote men who love women? So again, I think
why don't you take that question, since you were following Gillibrand's performance very closely?
Well, look, I'm gonna have to say, I think we talked about this yesterday about who is it that needs to have a good. Obviously there are people who we have to make sure that they have a good debate. And people who need to have a good debate so they can stay in the race, right? And I thought coming in, Gillibrand needed to at least allow people to think, well, why is this woman a U.S. senator, and why is she even on the stage? Why she even why does she have the audacity to do that? And I think she actually really did. I think she's there self a service. I think she was very eloquent. I think and again, I think she's been very active. Not just on reproductive rights, but just in terms of women's rights in general, both in the state of New York, but also on a national level. I thought in terms of that segment itself, it gave her an opportunity to shine. I think the candidates themselves could have spoken a little bit more about, this connection of not just reproductive rights as like almost as an entitlement, but almost like of a basic human right? I mean, when you think about what the women in our lives, right? My sister, I think of my wife, I think of my daughter, in terms of those things, when we think about those women and what they need, what they have earned, what they should have, it just seems to me that a lot of times we get into discussion of reproductive rights and reproductive justice almost as a checklist kind of a thing, and sometimes the almost common sense of it all kind of gets a little lost. So I'm not quite sure if, at least my opinion, Tanya, I'm not sure if we were any more enlightened, in terms of on the issue. But that's how I see it. That's how I was kind of viewing it in.
Yeah, you should ask Tanya if she can provide her comment. We can share it with people. Tanya is a coworker
what do you
of
think,
mine.
Tanya?
Yeah, Tanya is a coworker of mine, and I'm very appreciative of her support. I thought the women's rights conversation, well, outside of Gillibrand today, I thought yesterday that conversation the reproductive rights conversation was crisper and more substantive. I thought it was more kind of platitudes today, or just kind of like discussing the line, where I think they got in a little more detail. I think the reproductive justice line, I think, was Julian's yesterday, and it just seemed to kind of stick out more. I wanted to ask before we get into some of the other candidates. I wanted to get you guys' general impression about how you felt people talked about immigration and specifically the border crisis and the torturing of our children. James, what do you think the candidates the last few days have risen to the level of urgency and leadership that it's going to require to deal with this situation?
I think the Democratic candidates collectively definitely did that. I think it's really clear that all of these 20 folks we've seen in the last couple of days are going to do something starkly different, not just than what's been done in the last 2.5, 3 years, but what's been happening really for like the last decade or more.
But to me, the question, James, is that enough? I think that we all should ask ourselves that, right? Because sure, of course, they wouldn't do this. But the question is, even though we're running for president, should they be showing more leadership and try to address the issue now?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, in this, you mean in terms of what's happening in Congress right now?
Well, yeah, I'm saying as presidential candidates, you're trying to be president of the United States. Are we, and I know they're busy, right? But are we, what was their rhetoric around what we need to do now, not what we're going to do in a year and a half? Of course, that goes without saying almost to me. The question is, are we, are they showing enough leadership about how to deal with it now? We know some people with the homestead the last few days. I know Elby's been monitoring that very closely. We've had friends interacting with these people. But is that enough?
Yeah.
Rhetoric, but is there enough leadership? Because we got to deal with this right now. We need to address it right now.
I do think that a lot of the candidates and a lot of the leadership in Congress on the Democratic side are stepping forth, right? But it's not to be an apologist for them, of course. But they're up against McConnell in the Senate, who is just not going to flinch, and he could give a shit less who's dying, on the border or not. He just doesn't care. What he cares about is bringing in more conservative judges and so forth. And of course, Trump is a lunatic, right? He's a lunatic and a racist, and isn't going to flinch, right? So they're kind of beating their heads against the wall, but I think at least they're willing to do that, right? They're willing to kind of beat their heads against the wall and get on television and talk, point blank about the fact that in many cases, these children are experiencing torture. I wrote a column that should run in the Arizona Mirror tomorrow. It's a progressive publication here, in which my lead was the president of the United States of America is to blame for the death of Oscar Martinez and his daughter Valeria. Point blank, right? He is to blame for that, and
he's to blame for these 6 children that have died.
Now, I do think this, though, that I think what the candidates were talking about tonight and last night is that they were delivering a message that this is going to be a priority for us when we step into office, and that we are going to be pushing hard for real immigration reform, and we're not going to take the route of sending 5,000 more Border Patrol agents to the border to address this issue, and certainly not build, as Ruben Gallego said.
Yeah,
So I think that
I think that they're too
clear.
Sorry, Jen.
No. The last thing I say is that I think, as we said earlier, they've moved that conversation in a much more progressive direction, and they're going to carry that straight into the White House. Whereas in 2013, there were a lot of Democrats who were compromising a whole hell of a lot with McCain and others to pass something that they just thought could squeak through. Right.
I'm going to get to you, Albie, but one of the things is that another thing you could argue that Julian has pulled this conversation towards, and you saw it particularly for some of the B-level candidates or the lower tier candidates today, was more of a conversation around Latin America as sort of being a partner in resolving and dealing with this crisis. Elby, this was some of the most progressive conversation I've ever seen Democrats talk about is come to immigration. In terms of how we deal with, sort of civil versus criminal offenses being undocumented, how we deprioritize people that have not done any harm as undocumented in this country. This given the undocumented population, offering them the opportunity to buy into the healthcare market. This is for the Democratic Party. This is not small statements they were making. How do you think that's going to impact the rest of this conversation? This could be a huge issue in the general.
Well, I think first I want us to step back and think about and really reflect, what does that actually mean? I mean, we're talking about a party here, first of all, that controlled both the House and the Senate, in 2008 through 2010. They could have done something about immigration, and they didn't. Now, a lot could be said as to why. We were in a recession, like we were trying to come up from the Great Recession.
And
we were trying to do stuff.
And on the point, I'm sorry, but on the point on healthcare access for the undocumented population, and even the documented population, because of the 5-year hold for Medicaid, they could have dealt with that portion of the immigration issue in the ACA.
In the ACA, right? And they didn't, right? And in fact, it could be well argued, rightly so, that for a long time the Democratic Party used immigration as a wedge issue, right? And so they really wanted to kind of just hang in the cut, right, and stoke the flames, but not really do anything or not go as far, because they also realized that it was also good for politics, right? Now, whether that's right or wrong, it certainly they certainly could. There's a legitimate beef there, right? And I think to hear these statements today, to say that they're actually going to move forward, goes to show you how where we're coming. And again, as James said, because of the way the GOP has swung so much to the right, to be kind of it's kind of forced those kind of positions into play. But it also, to me, I think points to the power of dreamers and other undocumented folks and organizers to get the party to shift to that way, right? That being said, I think we heard them talk about what's going on at the border as child abuse, as state-sanctioned violence, right? Or state-sanctioned trauma. I think that's what the term was. I think that Marion said, which, you know what? If you had told me this about a year ago, even I would have been like, the whole state-sponsored thing, what does that really mean? But this is totally legitimate, right? When you look exactly how this is done. And so the ability for even someone like, for her to, for Williamson to be able to say that, and no one, especially those moderates, not to jump up and say, oh, no, well, that's a little too far, goes to show you how much in terms of the party is willing to go. And how people truly believe the state of where we've been at, right? And I mean, Madeline Villanueva adds, not only trauma, but also kidnapping. This idea that it's kidnapping. And not only Williamson said that, but, the former governor of Colorado also talked about that being straight up kidnapping.
For sure, that's right.
Yeah, and that's, that's not just deep. That's something that can be used.
I want to ask the panel if they have any thoughts about some of the other candidates. Governor Hickenlooper, you just referenced, Congressman Eric Swalwell, Marianne Williamson, Senator Bennett, and Andrew Yang. But James, I wanted to go to you. Remind people they can find you on social media. And if you have any final thoughts about the immigration conversation before we go to the other candidates.
Okay, so real quick, first of all, if you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at JG_Vanguardia or Vanguardia, si quieres. And then I'm on, you can find my website, vanguardiaarizona.com, and certainly find me on Facebook. So just two super quick things about immigration. I was in some ways almost knocked over by how many people on stage tonight were saying, if you haven't committed any other crime and you've violated and you've entered the country without documents, we should just leave you alone. Not. I mean, some people were certainly saying,
not a small statement, my man. You're right.
Because the most liberal thing or progressive thing people had been saying was we should go after criminals first, and then we'll get you guys later, right? And so many people were essentially, and I thought to myself,
that's what Obama was.
That would have happened even 4 years ago, right? That would have happened. That kind of conversation could have happened even a couple of years ago.
2.5. You're right.
Right. So that's amazing, and I think it actually is probably being read not just by the pantheon of the candidates as a legitimate stance, but probably being received in general pretty well by certainly a majority of Democrats and probably a substantial number of Americans, because we all know that something like 70% plus, of the American public want a path to citizenship for the undocumented who are here now, right? Which we wouldn't know if we just listened to Trump. I think that's a pretty amazing development in our culture.
And I'm telling you, you look back on it, Julian has pulled this conversation from last night. LB, quickly, I know you were following Gillibrand closely. I mean, where do you think she goes from here? Do you think she got a bump from tonight? Where do you think she becomes more viable after this evening?
I think she definitely stays. I mean, I think our question yesterday, but like, who gets to go to Detroit, or who gets to make the pitch about going to Detroit, right? Which is the next debate. And I think I think she makes the case. I mean, shoot, she
was
makes just as
feisty.
smart. She makes and it's not just feisty. She was good. Like, I mean, like, and it's not just. And I'm not saying you didn't think she was good, but what I'm saying is that, like, she. I think a lot of times people have wondered whether she stands in the shadow of a bunch of other New Yorkers. First, it was like, does she stand in the shadow of Hillary? Does she stand in the shadow of Chuck Schumer, who's the senior senator, right? And so, what
Does she stand in the
bring to
shadow of,
table?
in this race, Warren and Harris, in
Warren and
particular,
some of these
the other women?
right?
And I think she learned playing off day one, day two. I think Gillibrand looked at Klobuchar's performance yesterday and said, if I'm not aggressive, and if I don't show energy, I'm going to get forgotten about very quickly in this conversation.
Yeah, I definitely think, and the quote that stands in my mind for her when she was, again, talking about the reproductive, justice issues, and when she talked about compromises that were made on the backs of women, right? Like this idea that, again, just like immigration on ACA, on something that compromises, to reproductive justice were made on the backs of women. That's a really good point. It's a valid point. And it's a point, especially I think in this Me Too era, it kind of almost galvanizes, those huge crowds of women who came and marched after Inauguration Day. They have told us time and time again that they're willing to stand up and to lead. And here she's kind of trying to tap into that. Now, I'm not saying she was totally successful in doing that, but I think, she deserves another look as to whether or not what role she could play, right? It also, I'll be quite honest, she also makes the case for, like, wow, maybe she deserves a little bit more of a leadership spotlight in the Senate, right? I think if anything, in terms of coming out of this debate, she might, if she can reel off a couple of debates, maybe she might not be the candidate, but she does come up, I think, in terms of raising her national profile and at least her profile in terms of in the Senate.
James, anything from the other minor candidates the other candidates you wanted to mention that stuck out to you?
I think the other candidates are done. Wow. They seem like nice people, and they're all good at what they've been doing in their lives, and I don't fault them at all for that. But
you don't think Congressman Swalwell's? How do you think his attack on Biden went? The passing the torch piece.
Yeah, I think it helps him as a congressman. It helps him in terms of a Senate run. He was respectable, but
standing up for the Parkland kids. You're not giving my man no love.
I just don't think they said anything that lifted them into the top tier.
Interesting. I thought Senator Bennett had a shot. I think he had moments. I think Bennett, and I try not to focus on the aesthetic. Bennett's body language as the night progressed, he went from looking mad to looking intense to looking defeated. He just had this he had a lot going on. And I think his tone at times was uneven. But he's a capable guy, and he actually talked about some of the things he's gotten to move the ball.
But there's nobody on stage that was embarrassing in any way, shape, or form.
Well, Marianne Williams at the end got a little kooky.
Somebody staring off into the distance, going, "Why am I here?"
Marianne Williams is going to be the SNL character on Saturday. I mean, she's going to call her girlfriend in New Zealand. I was saying she was going to make an impact. LB, anything else on the other candidates that you thought was of note?
I will say that I thought that the second tier candidates today didn't come as prepared as yesterday's ones. And again, maybe I'm into the theatrical a little too much. But I just, they didn't make the cut. They just didn't make the cut.
Hickenlooper does not speak in sound bites. He's a bright guy, and I don't just stick up with him. He's a silly guy. He was a good governor. He was a good mayor of Denver.
Policy-wise, all that.
And he's good. He's got some interesting. I don't think he makes it to
Detroit.
Well, he just doesn't speak in sound bites. And let me tell you something. I almost want to give, and not just because I like the idea of him and I like his vibe, his ethos, but I almost want to give Andrew Yang an incomplete because.
I agree with you on that.
They didn't. What, ask him 3 questions? That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree.
That's not fair. It's not fair. No, this guy has more support than 5 or 6 of these candidates, and he got ignored. That wasn't fair.
Yeah, and I think I think he definitely gets an incomplete. I think he gets to come. I think he should get to come back just because they ignored him. I think they ignored him more than some other people were ignored yesterday.
Absolutely,
right?
He was ignored the most. That's right. That's right.
And I think yeah,
and he didn't
I
have the persona to jump in because he had to jump in. And that was my fear. I called it on yesterday's show that Yang was going to be silent.
And I'm a little surprised. But are you surprised, Ray? I'm a little surprised that happened to him. I thought
no,
he might,
because
no, I'm not surprised.
No, I'm not surprised. They don't want, that was like de Blasio. They don't want the real lefties to have a little charisma to say too much. I'm telling you. It's what happened to Bernie in 16 to a lesser degree.
No, I guess what I'm saying is that I'm not I guess I'm surprised that he didn't step up. Like I just that
I mean, he's not a politician. I know. I mean, he should have known, especially from yesterday, and he saw it happening.
He was listening to the cast. He should have been listening to the webcast.
Yeah, I think he was. I think he just walked in a little naive, and he was thinking, "I'm going to get my fair shake. These guys are going to want to talk to me."
Not the way life works.
What he forgot is that the anchors are trying to make news, right? We want to see what Kamala says to Biden. We want to see.
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
They're trying to make news.
Before we wrap this up and get your final thoughts, and again, me and LB love the theatrical stuff. What was up with the audience today? I mean, they were just so animated. I don't know if the crowd control issue. Do you think? I guess my question to you, LB, because I know you love the theatrics like I do, is do you think it was hard for me to tell if the candidates, because it seemed like everyone was getting like all this ruckus applause at some point, even the minor people, is that the candidates planted people unlike yesterday? Or do you think there was just like a crew of Latinos in the back that were just hype about being there? That like won these tickets, like the church group got 50 in the back and they were just like so happy to show up, so what?
I mean, it's Thursday. Did they go to happy hour before? I mean, I don't know. It's Miami.
But it was a completely different vibe in that audience today. And it was almost like I don't know where it was coming from. Do you think that was strategically placed, folks?
I don't. I will say this. I think there's a lot of support for Bernie in Miami. I think among like union folks, and I think among like folks even who are, in terms of part of this elected elite, if people want to talk about it that way. So I think that there's definitely people there. I think, he was around today and did a bunch of stuff. I think all these top tier candidates were in forums and meetings and things like that. So I think that people were genuinely happy to hear some of the comments that folks were talking about. So I think that was definitely the case. And I do think that there were people in the audience that were supporters of these candidates, right? Yeah, I there might have been people who were there yesterday and today, and they were just more excited about who was in the room today than they were yesterday.
James, give us your thoughts about from a journalistic perspective, how the moderators did the questions, obviously the settings, the challenge with the 10 people. What were your thoughts about the outcome?
I think I was a little bit surprised at how sometimes the moderators just let it get so out of control. They didn't seem to have that much control over kind of what was happening. And I don't blame them completely, because I think a lot of the candidates saw last night's debate and they're like, 10 people, how do you get noticed? Well, you just better dive in head first and speak up. And, so they were all trying to do that, especially in that first 15, 20 minutes. It was kind of chaotic, right? But I think, I think they could have been more pointed, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, the candidates didn't get under control until Kamala sort of slapped them down, right? And said they don't want to see a food fight. They want to hear what we have to say. And then after that, the candidates all got a little bit.
Line of the night. Yeah, it was. The first 30, 40 minutes was a
battle royale. Mom came into the kitchen and said, "Kids, behave," right? And they were like, "Oh, okay," which is.
But we kind of knew that going in. I think we knew that. I think everyone who I talked to, even people who weren't political folks, like they wanted to tune in tonight, right? Because they knew it was like that these were folks that potentially were combustible. And that some
they thought, but a lot of them thought that was going to be about Bernie and Biden, and it ended up being about about Kamala and Biden.
Yeah,
and that's my big picture takeaway.
In general, by the way, I think the questions were pretty good. I think they kind of hit all the notes that they needed to hit as moderators. But I was stunned when they asked that question about the greatest global threat, a geopolitical threat on the planet, and last night everybody said everything but Russia, and I'm thinking, how the hell is that possible after 2 years of the investigation? And we
Yang
know
Gang
that
was like,
Russia
"Don't
did.
pick on
And we
my
know,
heritage. It's
yeah, and
Russia. They're the big
we
problem."
know that Trump's writing love letters to Kim
Oh my
and
God.
having private, off the record meetings with Putin. What the hell are they talking about? Right, the greatest.
Well,
Right? It's
yeah.
not China right now.
I get my panelists' final thoughts, well, we do have to talk about, and we talked yesterday on the post game about the sort of Julian moment. But one of the things that was a big conversation, particularly in Latino activists and Latino journalism media circles, was the Hispandering that took place last night. None of that happened today. We kind of anticipated it. There wasn't anyone, with possibly the exception of Harris, that had a strong Latino background or flavor in terms of engaging the Latino community. But last night, definitely, three people speak Spanish. Beto famously sort of stole Booker's thunder by speaking Spanish in his opening remarks. Booker was, so there was a lot of conversation around the use of the Spanish language, the use of non-Latinos using Spanish,
Yeah.
particularly in this setting. So just any thoughts, James and LB, about that conversation we were having online and throughout the day today?
Yeah, it generally it just felt contrived, right? Last night it felt contrived. I'm glad they didn't go there tonight.
I didn't think anybody was going to go
I
there
just,
tonight.
I just felt like thank you, but unless you're going to deliver, some really specific and announce a policy plan, and somehow it has to be delivered in Spanish. If it was your immigration plan, and if you're out there and you're undocumented, here's what eso es lo que voy a hacer, right? Uno, dos, tres. If you were going to do that, cool. But the rest of it just came off to me as contrived.
There'll be a lot of interesting conversations on sort of the Latino media circles today around that issue. Memes, jokes,
I mean,
critiques.
there were memes and there were jokes. I, as somebody who tends to believe in issues around language justice and things like that, I wasn't mad at Beto. I think people who hate Beto, hate him anyway, right?
Either.
But I agree. It's like it's a one-trick pony, right? If you did it, if you did it today, then you would have been whacked. I mean, like that's just straight, right? But I thought was interesting though was, again, there was some blowback that is naturally happens when we speak Spanish in public, right? And that to me is what is, that I at least was trying to tell people to be like, okay, we're kind of making fun, but think about why you're really kind of making it that way, right? And I saw a tweet, Audrey Huff of all people, right? Former Tampa Bay Ray, former Giant guy, knows this whole big huff about like, oh, isn't this America? Why you got three white guys speaking Spanish? First of all, I mean, Julian Castro ain't no white guy, right? But not to be anything like that. But the point was like, again, some folks kind of doing that. And I think that's where sometimes this issue around language gets into that. Was it awkward? Yes. I would have preferred, like what James was saying, like if you're going to say something, it's like, oh, I would say to every documented person, mira, te quiero decir esto, and that would make more sense, right? And I think what it shows is their lack of real Latino staff or Latinx staff who can tell them, how do you properly do that? How do you make that seem natural, and how it makes it flow?
Well, staff that has the gravitas to tell them, right? Because Beto got plenty of Latinos working for him, but there's definitely a cult of personality going on in Western Texas with Beto.
One thing I will say about that, is that, again, to me, it was a bit of a symbol of how far left the party has moved. Would they have dared do that in 2016 or 2012, right?
I don't remember Bill Richardson speaking Spanish in 2008. Even though he did remind people in front of the Nevada caucus he was Latino. So I remember that being something. But
because they might have been thinking to themselves, I'm going to lose the middle, right? I'm going to lose the center vote that I need. That's
right. Yo, and so before we wrap this up, LB, any other feedback or anything else from the chats? I know we got people on Periscope, Facebook Live. Any other interactions you wanted to note, or just shout out anyone that's been following the conversation?
I really want to shout out, I want to shout out these ladies that are in the chat room. I really wish that they, like when we do this again another time, that we can get some of these folks, on screen, because, they're really powerhouses out there. So, again, I think Madeline Villanueva just dropping a little bit of knowledge saying, about this issue around Spanish and around language. She said, Madeline says, quote, funny you say Julian's a white. A post by a black professor yesterday made a comment about Beto's use of Spanish. And on the thread, someone mentioned how Latinos be knocking on the door of whiteness, and there are Latinos who self-identify as white. So again, I think that there's definitely this issue around language and whiteness and what is that. I think, again, sounds like a really great topic for another video discussion, right?
You're right about that,
in
brother.
Terms of bringing in folks.
You're right about
also, that. Want to give a little shout out also to your colleague Tanya Valencia, who says Cory Booker Spanish plus any reggaeton beat in the background equals a hot remix. Test it out for a good laugh. Cory Yankee.
But Tanya, there was a little. I was explaining my theory about that yesterday, James. Is that Cory's from Newark, New Jersey, and if people don't realize around the country that Newark has a very large Latino population, traditional Puerto Rican community, and it's probably about 50-50 at this point, close, right? So the Black and Latino, but the East Ward is the traditional, old school Spaniard, but traditional Portuguese community, and now it's Brazilian and Latin American immigrants. So I think his Spanish and his Portuguese got tied up there. So he didn't have his best Spanish day because his Spanish, frankly, that's the worst Spanish I've ever heard him speak. His Spanish usually a little better.
Yeah, he's spoken better. For sure. I don't think he had a good.
And Julian kept it simple. Adios.
I want to give also a shout out to the folks over at NPR and the folks here at WLRN who did a story. We were literally talking about the translators on Telemundo, and they literally did a story this morning about like what it was like to sit in the translation room and the variety of different things. Which yeah, and so but it brings up the question. I think Ray, you and I were talking about this. Is that like again, if these candidates could pick somebody to actually, will candidates, especially as the Latino vote becomes more of an issue and becomes more important, will some of these candidates actually start to choose who will be their voice, not just in terms of spokespeople, but even like on the translation, who might be their translation voice. And what does it mean in terms of like the language? Do you go with the Colombiano Spanish? Do you go with the Mexicano Chicano Spanish? Do you go with like
Osuna to be my voice, brother? I would. Let me tell you, you want to get someone. I don't know. Bad Bunny might intimidate people,
or Antonio Banderas. Who's going to be your guy?
Well, you're showing your age there, brother.
That sounds like an SNL skit.
As we wrap this up, we've got about a month before the next debates in Detroit. For people that are not as aware, the bigger benchmark is happening in a few days because the fundraising quarter is going to really sort of probably weed out as much as these debates weed out some of the lower tier candidates. So over the next 3 or 4 weeks, as sort of the residue of this debate comes up, the summer season, the media is going to love to cover the Iowa State Fair. They're going to all eat corn dogs, and New Hampshire and South Carolina. The early states will come back into focus as we prep for the next set of debates in Detroit. Obviously, I would imagine the issues around civil rights in the Black community will come center stage in that setting. What else should we be looking? What are you guys going to look out for as activists, as journalists over the next 3 or 4 weeks as it relates to the presidential debates? LB, let's start with you.
Well, I think people also forget that the summer is traditionally also, especially for folks of color, conference season, right? You got the NAACP has their conference, Unidos has their conference. Usually, sometimes the journalism organizations have their conferences.
NALEO just had their conference, and they had
NALEO just had theirs, right? And so it'd be interesting to see if and how some of these candidates actually make appearances there, which ones do and which ones don't. So to me, I think that would be interesting. And again, I think honestly, like seeing how some of this, the census question today, the Supreme Court decided that they were going to send it back. They didn't necessarily give it a
split decision with gerrymandering in the census.
Well, it's a gerrymandering decision, and they didn't go. Again, I think this is Roberts trying to save the court's face a little bit because basically what Roberts said was that you didn't give us a good reason. Right, he said you didn't give. It's not that there's no reason to have the census question there, but he just said you didn't give us actually a good reason. And so now this question now whether Trump wants to delay the census and whether he's playing political football with it. And so I think that I want to look at. To me, I think that's an important thing to figure out because the census is really important to our folks, and the gerrymandering decision is also really important. And so figuring out how
we'll talk about that next time. Awful. That is absolutely awful. We got to get some legal folks to to break that down.
Yeah.
James, what are your thoughts? Final thoughts as we finish
Well,
up this episode.
well, I think that it breaks my heart to say that the situation with immigration is going to get worse, right, before it gets
Yes.
better. There's nothing in Trump's in his soul that will turn him in any different direction right now, and he's
Yeah.
clinging to power, and that's he believes that's what he needs to win, and it's just going to get worse, and probably more people are going to die, and it's horrific. So that'll be talked about. I think yeah, the census to some degree. I think this whole question of where people are in terms of the economy, I think it's soaking into them that that the big tax cut that Trump and the GOP pushed through hasn't helped 85% of Americans, and you're one of them. And let's keep having that conversation. And I think that that's going to be a major topic of
You're absolutely right.
discussion.
That
And then
tax.
finally, I think they'll come back to healthcare. They'll
You
come
know,
back.
we the activist community didn't take advantage of this tax season because so many people that were, if not Trump supporters, Trump friendly, middle America, the middle class, the upper middle class that maybe isn't as more agnostic about politics. A lot of them saw that difference in that return. And I think as a community, we really haven't honed in on that conversation and reminded people about that swindle job. And I think you're absolutely right, James. And I want to take your comment a step further. It is going to get worse. And it's not just going to get worse for the immigrant community. We're going to see more hate crimes. We're going to see more examples. Journalists are getting threatened, and it said casually, our democracy is getting threatened. So a lot of erosion of, our personal safety. So we have to continue to support each other. LB, this has been outstanding. I want to thank our special guest from VanguardArizona.com, James Garcia. I look forward to spending some time with you over the summer, my friend, out in the southwest part of the
Look
country.
forward to it.
It'll be lovely. I'm sure in Arizona mid-August it'll just be so
Oh,
mild.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I'll be in a Foreman grill. And Elbert Garcia, my co-host, my producer for the special VCast. LB, just any final thoughts you may have.
I think it's been real heartwarming to hear how people have reacted to these last 2 nights of our analysis. Something that we kind of threw up at the air and just figured, hey, if no one else is doing it, let's do it. I had, I was listening to Ava DuVernay on a webinar today that she was giving with folks at Sundance. And one of the things that she said today was, you've got to put attention to your intention. You got to put attention to your intention. And I think that's, to really move forward, to move this country forward, to really attack the feeling of hopelessness that we're all feeling with what's going on, is that we have to spend every day putting a little bit of attention to our intention. And so I think, these podcasts, these video, casts was at least our part in trying to do that. And it just shows the need for us to actually have to continue. We don't know how we're going to do it. We know, what we're going to do. We certainly need to, make a couple of different improvements, including getting some women visually here on this. But I think we shouldn't let the our quest to be perfect stop us from doing anything at all.
And the feedback I got from people, and I'm gonna you channeled Anna, and I'm gonna channel Tyler Perry at the BET Awards earlier this week, is that, how come you all aren't on MSNBC? Wow, there's so many talented people, not just James LB, of course, but consistently when we do our shows every week and on a regular basis, and the kind of talent and the kind of activists that we bring to these conversations. And I'm like, at the end of the day, we're going to have to create our own MSNBC tables, because, we're always going to be sort of a side dish. I mean, think about what continues to take place, the aftermath of Puerto Rico. And I think the word Puerto Rico was uttered once in 4 hours of debates.
Yeah.
And these are all American citizens. You're all, so, and that's a climate change issue, and we can go on and on about it. But and by the way, most allows people relocated in Florida. And nary a word about it. So we need to create the spaces to have these conversations, and continue to support these voices. James, LB, and my brothers, love you guys, and I really appreciate the audience for hanging in with us, especially on the East Coast. It's a little late in the early morning, but for watching and listening and engaging, and continuing to push our perspective here on the Founding Translation Special VCast Night 2 Presidential Post Game Show. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good night.
Thanks, man.